The silver tea tray had not been polished in weeks, and the dust settling upon it looked like gray snow. For Elias, the sound of the world ending was not a roar or a flash, it was the sudden, sharp silence of the refrigerator humming to a halt, followed by his neighbor's dog howling until its throat went raw. He sat in his high-backed chair, the one with the frayed velvet, watching the light die in the kitchen. He did not check the news. He did not reach for his phone. He knew the weight of that silence. It was the same silence he had carried in his bones since the great hunger of his youth, a ghost he thought he had buried decades ago. Now, it had returned to claim the city, wrapping its cold fingers around every throat. By the third morning, the illusion of civilization began to peel away like wet wallpaper. It started with the feet. Thousands of feet scuffing against the asphalt, a rhythmic, desperate migration of people who had nowhere to go but could no longer stay still. Elias watched from his window as his neighbors, people who once argued over lawn trimmings and noise complaints, stood in the street with empty plastic jugs. Their faces were no longer the faces of accountants or teachers, they were the faces of prey. The supermarket at the corner had its windows shattered by noon. There was no anger in the shouting, only a high, thin vibration of terror. Men who had never lifted anything heavier than a briefcase were now fighting over dented cans of peaches, their knuckles bloody and their eyes wide with a frantic, animal light. The bread vanished first, then the dignity. Elias saw the young mother from 4B, a woman who used to hum lullabies in the hallway, standing by the dry community fountain. She was holding a silver necklace, offering it to a man with a wheelbarrow full of dirty rainwater. The man did not look at the jewelry, he looked at her thirst with a cold, calculated indifference. In this new world, gold had returned to its true form, just a heavy, yellow rock. The only currency left was mercy, and it was the one thing no one seemed to have in reserve. Elias felt a hollow ache in his chest, not from hunger, but from the sight of how quickly the soul can be bartered for a single swallow of water. He closed his curtains, preferring the darkness of his room to the blinding light of human collapse. As the weeks bled into a singular, agonizing season of gray, the sun seemed to lose its warmth, filtered through a permanent haze of distant smoke and unsettled earth. The city became a skeleton. Without the hum of engines or the glow of street lamps, the nights were absolute. In that predatory gloom, the worst of humanity crept out of the shadows, but so did the best of it, though far more quietly. Elias shared his last bag of dried lentils with an old stray cat that had taken refuge under his porch. The animal was skin and bone, its fur matted with ash, but it sat with him in the silence, a witness to his endurance. He realized then that the great tragedy of war was not the falling of buildings, but the slow, agonizing death of the small kindnesses that make a life worth living. In the village of his memory, Elias remembered his father saying that a man's character is like a clay pot, you only know if it is cracked when you fill it with boiling water. The water was boiling now. He watched through the cracks in his shutters as some men formed gangs to hoard what little remained, their laughter jagged and cruel against the silence of the starving. They took by force, justified by the lie that survival excused any sin. But then there was Miriam, the elderly schoolteacher from across the way. She spent her days sitting on her porch, tending to a single, struggling tomato plant with the dregs of her drinking water. She did not hide her meager fruit, she waited until the youngest child in the street walked by and handed it over with a smile that contained more power than any weapon. She was dying, everyone knew it, but she was dying as a human being, which was a victory the men with the guns could never understand. The injustice of it was a bitter smoke that filled the lungs. Why did the cruel thrive while the gentle withered? Elias knelt on his rug every evening, his knees cracking in the cold. He did not pray for a miracle, he did not ask for the sky to clear or the granaries to fill. He prayed for the strength to not hate the man who had stolen his firewood the night before. He prayed for his heart to remain soft even as his skin grew leather-hard from the elements. He realized that the war outside was merely a reflection of the war inside. The hunger for power had set the world on fire, and now, only the hunger for peace could keep a soul from turning to ash. He watched the horizon, where the fires of distant cities flickered like dying stars, and felt a profound, heavy pity for the architects of this ruin. They had gained the world and realized, too late, that it was a world of dust. By the second month, the migration had stopped. People no longer had the energy to flee. They huddled in the shells of their homes, waiting for an end that refused to come quickly. The silence was now heavy with the weight of those who had stopped breathing. Elias found himself walking to the park, his legs heavy and trembling. The trees had been stripped of their bark for fuel, standing like white ghosts in the mist. He sat on a bench near the dry pond and looked at his hands. They were stained with the soot of 1,000 fires, his fingernails broken, his wedding ring sliding loosely on a skeletal finger. He thought of his wife, long gone, and was glad she had not lived to see the day the sun turned cold. A young boy, perhaps 7 years old, approached him. The child was carrying a small wooden bird, crudely carved. He didn't speak, words had become a luxury no one could afford to waste. He simply sat next to Elias and leaned his head against the old man's shoulder. In that moment, the entire history of the world, the treaties, the borders, the grand speeches of kings, and the thunder of artillery, meant nothing. There was only the warmth of one body against another, 2 sparks of life in a vast, encroaching winter. Elias realized that the boy was not looking for food, he was looking for a reason to believe that the world still contained something other than fear. The transformation was complete. The world of glass and steel had returned to the world of earth and bone. As the light faded that evening, Elias felt a strange, quiet clarity. He saw that the true tragedy was not that the world had ended, but how much time they had wasted when it was still whole. They had fought over shadows and ignored the light. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried crust of bread he had been saving for his own final hour. He broke it in half, the sound of the snap loud in the stillness of the park. He gave the larger piece to the boy. There was no music, no heavenly choir, and no sudden rescue. There was only the boy's small hand taking the bread, and the soft sound of him chewing. The injustice remained. The world was still broken. But as Elias watched the boy, he felt a flicker of something that was not hope, but something deeper, a quiet, stubborn endurance. He understood then that even when the light of the world is extinguished, the light of a single soul can still cast a shadow. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind howl through the empty streets, and waited for the night to finish its work, holding the boy's hand in his own, a final, silent protest against the dark.